Unless peace begins on that small microcosm of a person's own life, there's not much hope of spreading it out to China and Russia and Japan and South America and Africa. But if you're a person of peace, and you're dedicated to peace, and you're willing to pray for peace, and you're willing to sacrifice for peace, then I think we can cast out this devil that I call the nuclear threat to humanity.
Notre Dame Hesburgh Professor Emeritus of Peace Studies, George Lopez.
Isn't it amazing that Scott and I were able to change shirts right at the same time? That's what he meant. Good afternoon. When Father Ted invited me in 1986 to come to the university to be helpful with the creation of the Kroc Institute, one of the things that struck me is the way he emphasized the size and scope of this. I had been I thought, reasonably successful teacher of peace studies at the famous Earlham College that Scott mentioned earlier, and had felt like I was making good contributions to the field. But Father Ted's vision, of course, was a place that not only would do teaching at a new level, but also research and also policy significance. And that dynamic, interactive triangle was going to require a kind of dedication that led me to try to re-examine, am I dedicated enough? Do I have the time? The personal and professional challenges that this involved really were stunning to me the more I thought about it. Should I say yes? Well, fortunately I did, and I think we've tried to do some good things over the last 32 years that I've been associated with this marvelous university, the Kroc Institute, and now the Keough School. But one of the things that struck me first about this dedication of the full life of dealing with peace really hit me as a teacher and an educator. You see, I had felt that often I'd go into a classroom, about this size, this number of people. You're supposed to laugh at that. And my approach would be, I wonder who's the one? Who's the one in here who's going to become the Assistant Secretary of State, or be the commando of NATO forces, or to be the journalist at the height of the discussion of crisis? And that person's ideas would make a difference as to whether or not there's going to be war or peace, whether or not there'd be use of nuclear weapons or not in a particular crisis. And if I did my job as a faculty person, that one person at that critical moment, maybe 30 years after they were in my classroom, they'd say the thing that made the difference. And of course, they'd be thinking, as Professor Lopez said, So the peace teaching challenge and the dedication that you needed for that began to change for me. And what did Father Ted charge us with doing? As Scott mentioned, the creation of a professional, marvelous program for peace builders in an intense environment of learning, teaching, and living together that hadn't really been a model used before. But there was something else. In the teaching of a wide range of undergraduates here, my colleagues and I learned that the new peace building that we were trying to envision as a way to get to that non-nuclear world, to get to a world of peace, just didn't involve the specialists. It also had to involve the marvelous Notre Dame undergraduates who were here because they were passionate about becoming a doctor, an architect, an accountant, a lawyer, a parent. What that meant is that we had to translate the research findings and the approaches that we used in dealing with specialists and make it the new citizenship education of our time. And that challenge really imposed a new dedication on us to have the finger on the pulse of you all as undergraduate and graduate students to try to make that translation. And that was a marvelous experience for me. It made me a far better collegiate teacher than I ever would have been otherwise. And then there was the research angle. Scott mentioned that in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, my good colleague and friend David Courtwright and I were looking at this changing dynamic. I mean, the Cold War had just ended. We were looking for how would the world now solve disputes in the midst of a world of increased globalization and the economies of the world changing. There no longer being a kind of east-west divide. And the UN Security Council's action at Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait was to impose economic sanctions. They'd only done that twice since 1945, and in each case, not very effectively. The use of economic sanctions as a way to end war or to denuclearize a particularly aggressive power became a real theme of the 1990s and early 2000s. And particularly in that decade of the 2000s, we found that the UN imposed economic sanctions a dozen times in that one decade. Our research became deeply involved with a number of governments that were testing out this new dynamic, and particularly the United Nations. In the right kind of Notre Dame approach to this, we were interested not only in the technical and economic and military dimensions of this, but particularly charged by people early on at the UN with how do you solve the dilemma that innocent people with general economic sanctions are hurt, not the leaders. That ethical dynamic, the human dynamic, pushed us to the edge and made us part of a small group of people worldwide who created what you now hear are targeted or smart sanctions. That is, the sanctions that were devised to financially constrain and work on bad leaders, and only those leaders, and have very little ripple effects down to the general population. That led us to be consultants to a wide variety of governments and to play a role over the last 25 years now in sanctions research for peace building that I think none of us would have thought possible. It reverberated very, very well back to the Kroc Institute, and now even more so to the Keough School in some marvelous ways. The policy dimension hit me in a way I didn't expect as a result of our research. In 2010, I got a call from the State Department, and they said, we'd like you to take a seat that's for the United States on the UN Security Council panel of experts for monitoring and implementing the sanctions on North Korea. It was almost an overwhelming opportunity. Through the good graces of Scott and various others, I was able to take an extra leave to be able to do this. And when people ask me what the experience was like, I sometimes say, well, with David and our colleagues doing 6 books and 40 articles about sanctions, we felt like the maitre d' of international sanctions. And I'd just been involved in a request to go to the sausage factory. The sausage factory of watching how sanctions play out on the ground, on what humanitarian impact might actually mean, on how you devise ways where the dike is leaking in so many places to plug holes. But it led to some interesting critical reflection back on what's the meaning of peace if these measures are designed to try to get there. Are the targeted financial sanctions that we're developing working, and how do we know? And then a particularly poignant moment when we were overseas working with a series of countries in a regional forum about how you tighten the sanctions in appropriate ways. We had some really difficult meetings. We came back to the hotel, my team and I, an international team, and my young Chinese colleague grabbed me by the shoulder and he said, I don't know why you continue to hate North Korea. And I said, you know, I don't think I'm hating North Korea here. What are we discovering here at this forum and the missions we had before? We're discovering the illicit finance, the illegal movement of uranium, the trade illegally in gyroscopes and guiding devices for missiles to launch ICBMs to other countries. I said, you in China and we in the United States and we in the UN, our task is to disrupt these illicit international networks that are fomenting greater nuclear proliferation. Let's help develop a security system for North Korea that keeps them safe, keeps them without nuclear threat, and maybe they won't develop their own systems, but they're only the latest client. What we need to do is choke off the networks. That's the goal we have. China, the UN, and the US, that's our goal. In silence, he left my room. And then I began to reflect further, because I was only 3 months away from coming back. And I realized that in the process of that policy work that Notre Dame had granted me an exception to be able to go do, my definition of what's the threat to peace had changed. It's not so much that's one country that's an enemy of another country, which is then a friend of somebody else who's somebody's enemy. It's rather the international crime and corruption and illicit networks that undercut the state peace and security system. So I came back to Notre Dame in 2011, deciding that what I would do in Intro to Peace Studies is talk about crime and corruption as the new great threat of peace. And the accountants and the economists and the architects and the people interested in environmental biology, which was going to take them across national boundaries, they said, oh, that makes sense. And so I had watched in the space of 20 plus years the charge of dedication that Father Ted gave us in coming to create the Kroc Institute, of that linkage between teaching, research, and policy had come true for me in a marvelous way. The circle even continues some more. Mike Desch will be out in a little bit. David, myself, a number of Notre Dame students, Jerry Powers, were able to be part of an audience and a symposium with the Pope in November of this past 2017, where the Pope really was in the lead in saying, look, the new level of modernization of weapons that's planned by a number of nations has to be considered for its moral significance. We have a world, like the Integral Human Development Challenge that the Keough School gives us, in which development, poverty, environmental crisis, those are the threats to people's security. They need to be addressed with aid and billions of dollars. To put billions of new dollars into the development of new and modernized weapon systems creates a grave moral crisis. And I thought back to that moment in 1986 when Father Ted said, this devil is something that we need to be challenged. The problems 32 years later are taking new form, but they're the same ones. I've been uniquely privileged to be part of a Kroc Institute and now a Keough School that deals with these in the shadow of the dome and the shadow of the lady that sits on the top, with Notre Dame graduates who in their own communities, in their own ways, and 500 master's candidates from the Kroc School working back in their own countries that have had this new challenge of peace that they've met. Thank you very much.